everyone.
Hi.
I'm Lauren.
I'm Jay.
And this is Paradise After Dark. Paradise After Dark is a Tomahawk Media production covering true crime,
Unsolved mysteries,
missing people,
urban legends,
and strange places.
Please check out our website, paradiseafterdark.com.
On the website, you'll find links to all of our episodes, even the archived episodes, our mailing list, merch store, and links to all of our social media.
We also have a virtual tip jar. Leave us a tip and we'll give you a shout out on the show.
So, once again, this coming weekend, Jay and I will be in London for CrimeCon UK. And if you haven't gotten your ticket yet, please go to crimecon.co.uk and use code PARADISE for 10% off.
In today's episode, due to the fact that we'll be going across to London, UK, we'll be covering the British Jeffrey Dahmer.
The British Jeffrey Dahmer!
That guy got some issues.
That's Dennis Nilsen. On December 30th, 1978, 14-year-old Stephen Holmes was at the Cricklewood Arms pub in the Cricklewood area of London, England, attempting to purchase alcohol. The bartender would not serve him, but a fellow patron at the bar, a man named Dennis Nilsen, told Holmes that he would supply him with alcohol that evening if he would just follow him back to his home. The two hung out at Nilsen's house, drinking and listening to music until they both fell asleep. The following morning, Nilsen woke first and would later confess that at that moment, he became afraid that Holmes would wake up and leave him. So he did what any other crazed lunatic would do. He straddled Holmes as he strangled him into unconsciousness with a necktie, then drowned him in a bucket filled with water. He then washed the body and placed him on the bed, proceeding to masturbate while he caressed the dead teenager. Poor 14-year-old Stephen Holmes just wanted some booze. But he became the first victim of Dennis Nilsen, a serial killer who would go on to be called the British Jeffrey Dahmer.
Dennis Nilsen was born November 23, 1945 in Fraserburgh, Scotland. After his parents divorced when he was about 3, he was raised with his 2 siblings by his mother and maternal grandparents. They all lived together in his grandparents' home. Nilsen became very close with his grandfather while growing up, and he fondly remembered the long walks in Scottish countryside they would take together. Sometimes his siblings would tag along, but mostly just Dennis and his grandfather.
According to author Brian Masters, who wrote the book titled Killing for Company, The Case of Dennis Nilsen, despite only being 5 years old, Nilsen vividly recalled these walks as being very long, along the harbor across a wide stretch of beach, up to the sand dunes, which rise 30 feet behind the beach, and on to Iverolcolly, another village. He later described this stage of his childhood as one of contentment, and his grandfather as being his great hero and protector, adding that whenever his grandfather, who was a fisherman, was at sea, life would be empty for me until he returned.
But on October 31st, 1951, while fishing in the North Sea, Nilsen's grandfather died of a heart attack at the age of 62. Again in Masters' book, in what Nilsen later described as his most vivid childhood recollection, his mother, weeping, asked him whether he wanted to see his grandfather. When he replied that he did, he was taken into a room where his grandfather lay in an open coffin. As Nilsen gazed upon the body, his mother told him his grandfather was sleeping, adding that he had gone to a better place.
Dennis Nilsen did not seem to deal with his grandfather's death very well. In the years that followed, he became more withdrawn from his family and would spend hours on the shore by the fishing pier, just gazing out into the ocean. As Nilsen grew and hit puberty, he quickly realized that he was gay. At first, this confused and shamed him, so he kept this fact hidden from his family and friends. According to Russell Coffey, author of the book titled Dennis Nilsen, Conversations with Britain's Most Evil Serial Killer, many of the boys that Dennis was attracted to look a bit like his younger sister Sylvia. On one occasion, he sexually fondled her, believing that his attraction towards boys might be a manifestation of the care he felt for her. On one occasion, he also caressed and fondled the body of his older brother as he slept. As a result of this, his brother began to suspect that Dennis was gay and regularly belittled him in public, referring to Dennis as a hen, which is a Scottish word for girl. After he finished high school, Dennis joined the army where he intended to train as a chef. While stationed in Aldershot, Hampshire, Nilsen's feelings began to stir, but he kept his sexual orientation well hidden from his colleagues. He never showered in the company of his fellow soldiers for fear of developing an erection in their presence.
Nilsen was first stationed in West Germany, and this is where he began to drink heavily. On one occasion, Nilsen and a German youth drank themselves into a stupor. When Nilsen awoke, he found himself on the floor of the German youth's flat. No sexual activity had occurred, but this incident fueled Nilsen's sexual fantasies, which initially involved his sexual partner being completely passive. According to Russell Coffey's book, these fantasies further developed into Nilsen's partners being unconscious or dead.
It's very Jeffrey Dahmer-ish, don't you think?
Yeah. Creepy.
In 1967, he was deployed to the state of Aden, formerly Aden Colony, now part of Yemen, where he worked as a cook at the Al Mansoura prison. This was a dangerous place to be, and Nilsen was once kidnapped by a taxi driver. He was thrown into the trunk of the car. Upon being dragged out of the car, Nilsen grabbed a jack handle and knocked the taxi driver to the ground before beating him unconscious. He then locked the man in the boot of the taxi.
Upon leaving the army in 1972, he took up police training where he discovered a fascination with morgue visits and autopsied bodies. Despite the obvious advantages the police work gave to develop his morbid taste, he re-signed and went on to become a recruitment interviewer.
In 1973, a man named David Painter accused Nilsen of taking photos of him while he slept. Painter was so enraged that he required hospitalization as a result of their confrontation. Nilsen was brought in for questioning about the incident, but was subsequently released without charge. During the summer and autumn of 1973, Nilsen began frequenting gay pubs and engaged in several casual liaisons with men. But this only made his loneliness worse, as each partner would leave after the encounter was over. He longed for a lasting relationship. In 1975, Nilsen moved in with a man named David Gallichan in a garden apartment situated at 195 Melrose Avenue in North London. Although Gallichan denied that they had a homosexual relationship, Nilsen claimed that they did have sex on occasion. Their relationship was up and down, with Nilsen resentful that Gallichan didn't work and Gallichan claiming that Nilsen was verbally abusive. This lasted 2 years, and when Gallichan left, Nilsen's life began a downward spiral into alcohol and loneliness, which culminated in his first murder 18 months later. Let's take a quick break, and we'll be back.
On October 11, 1979, Nilsen attempted to murder a student from Hong Kong named Andrew Ho, whom he had met at St. Martin's Lane pub and lured to his flat on the promise of sex. Nilsen attempted to strangle Ho, who managed to flee from his flat and reported the incident to the police. Nilsen was questioned in relation to the incident, but Ho decided not to press charges. That is exactly what happened with that one incident from
Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yeah.
Yeah, the two cases are really
where the kid escaped.
The two cases really mirror each other. So Jeffrey Dahmer could even be considered the British or the American Dennis Nilsen. Nilsen encountered his second victim, Canadian tourist Kenneth Ockenden, at a pub on December 3rd, 1979. Following a day of sightseeing and drinking, which ended at Nilsen's apartment, Nilsen again succumbed to his fears of abandonment and strangled Ockenden to death with an electrical cable. He cleaned up the corpse as he did before and shared the bed with it overnight. The following day, Nilsen purchased a Polaroid camera and photographed Ockenden's body in various suggestive positions. He took photos, engaged in sex, and finally hid the corpse under the floorboards of his home, removing it frequently to engage in conversation, as if Ockenden were still alive.
His third victim, some 5 months later, was Martin Duffy, a homeless 16-year-old who he invited to spend the night on May 13, 1980. Duffy was a catering student from Birkenhead, Merseyside, who had hitchhiked to London without his parents' knowledge. As with his first victim, Nilsen strangled, then drowned him before bringing him back to bed and masturbating over the teenager's corpse. Duffy was kept in a wardrobe for 2 weeks before joining Ockenden under the floorboards.
Following Duffy's murder, Nilsen began to kill with increasing frequency. Before the end of 1980, he killed a further 5 victims and attempted to murder one other. Only one of these victims, whom Nilsen murdered, a 26-year-old named William Sutherland, has ever been identified. Another one of his victims, 24-year-old Malcolm Barlow, was an orphan with learning disabilities, who was soon dispatched by strangulation. By the time Barlow was killed, Nilsen was forced to stuff him under the kitchen sink, as he was rapidly running out of storage space, with 6 bodies hidden around the apartment. He was forced to spray rooms twice a day to rid them of flies that were hatching from the decomposing bodies. When neighbors complained about the smell, he convinced them it stemmed from structural problems in the building. To dispose of the corpses, Nilsen would remove his clothing and dismember them on the stone kitchen floor with a large kitchen knife, sometimes also boiling the skull to remove the flesh, also placing organs in plastic bags for disposal. He buried limbs in the yard and stuffed torsos into suitcases until he could burn the remains in a bonfire. He added pieces of tire to the fires to mask the stench of burning flesh. On occasion, he would burn fires all day without raising any suspicion from his neighbors. He generally crushed the bones once the fire had consumed the flesh, and police found thousands of bone fragments in the garden during later forensic examinations.
Nilsen's recollection of the unidentified victims were vague, but he graphically recalled how each victim had been murdered and just how long the body had been retained before dissection. Nilsen remembered one identified victim he killed and had moved his legs in a cycling motion as he was strangled.
Dennis Nilsen claimed he did not like murdering his lovers. In a desperate attempt to stop himself, when his landlord asked him to move out of his home due to renovations that were being planned, Nilsen chose to move into a top-floor apartment with no backyard and no floorboards that he could hide things in. But that only worked for a little while.
Nilsen killed 3 more men while living in his apartment: John Hallett, Archibald Graham Allen, and Stephen Sinclair. But just as he originally planned, he had much more trouble disposing of the bodies. Now he was forced to dismember the bodies even more. He boiled the hands and feet and dissected the bodies in smaller pieces that could be flushed down the toilet and disposed of in plastic bags.
There were 5 other apartments in Nilsen's building, though, and his gruesome activities soon became noticed. In February of 1983, another tenant in the building called out drain specialist Dino Rod employee Michael Cratton to investigate a drain blockage. In the presence of the tenants, including Nilsen, the technician discovered rotting human remains when he descended via the outdoor manhole, and it was decided that a full inspection would be conducted the next day, after which the police would be called in to investigate. Upon hearing Catran exclaim how similar the substance was in appearance to human flesh, Nilsen replied, "It looks to me like somebody's been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." That night, Nilsen tried to hide his actions by removing the flesh from the drains, but was spotted by a neighbor.
Michael Catran returned the following morning to find the drain had been mostly cleared, but he has still found some flesh and small bones that he believed to be finger bones. He also found an eyeball that appeared to be human. Catran and his supervisor, Gary Wheeler, called the police.
The remains were taken to the mortuary in Hornsey, where pathologist David Bowen advised police that the remains were human, and that one particular piece of flesh, he concluded, had been from a human neck and bore a ligature mark. Nilsen was met on the evening of February 9th by Detective Chief Inspector J., who informed him that they wished to question him in relation to the human remains that had been discovered in the drains. Upon entering the apartment, Jay noticed the pervasive foul odor and asked Nilsen what it was, at which point he calmly confessed that what they were looking for was stored in bags around the apartment, which included 2 dismembered heads and other larger body parts.
Between 1978 and 1983, Nilsen is known to have killed a minimum of 12 men and boys and have attempted to kill 7 others. He initially confessed in 1983 to having killed about 16 victims. After the confession, Nilsen was held at Brixton Prison pending trial. While there, he wrote over 50 notebooks of his memories to assist the prosecution and also drew what he referred to as sad sketches, which detailed his treatment of some of his victims. Dennis Nilsen's trial began on October 24, 1983. Nilsen was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 charges of attempted murder. He pleaded not guilty all the charges, citing diminished responsibility due to a mental defect. Well, no shit.
2 psychiatrists testified on behalf of the defense. The first was James McKeith, who testified as to how, through a lack of emotional development, Nilsen experienced difficulty expressing any emotion other than anger, and his tendency to treat other human beings as components of his fantasies. The psychiatrist also described Nilsen's association between unconscious bodies and sexual arousal, stating that Nilsen possessed narcissistic traits, an impaired sense of identity, and was able to depersonalize other people. He stated his conclusions that Nilsen displayed many signs of maladaptive behavior, and the combination of which in one man was lethal. The second psychiatrist to testify for the defense, Patrick Galway, diagnosed Nilsen with borderline false self as if pseudo-normal narcissistic personality disorder, with occasional outbreaks of schizoid disturbances. Galway stated in episodic breakdowns, Nilsen became predominantly schizoid, acting in an impulsive, violent, and sudden manner. Galway further added that someone suffering from these episodic breakdowns is most likely to disintegrate under circumstances of social isolation. In effect, Nilsen was not guilty of malice aforethought or premeditation.
Despite these testimonies, the jury didn't buy Nilsen's insanity defense and found him guilty on all charges. Dennis Nilsen was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years. Following his conviction, Nilsen was transferred to HMP Wormwood Scrubs, a men's prison in West London, to begin his sentence.
He never filed any appeals to his sentence, although prison life was up and down for Dennis Nilsen. At first, he was put in with the general population and was able to roam freely with other prisoners. But in December of 1983, Nilsen was cut in the face and chest with a razor blade by an inmate named Albert Moffat, resulting in injuries requiring 89 stitches. Afterward, he was briefly transferred to HMP Parkhurst before being transferred to HMP Wakefield, where he remained until 1990. In 1991, Nilsen was transferred to a vulnerable prison unit in HMP Full Sutton upon concerns for his safety. He remained there until 1993 when he was transferred to HMP Whitmore, again in general population, with increased segregation from other inmates.
In the years following his incarceration, Nilsen composed an unpublished 400-page autobiography entitled The History of a Drowning Boy. Nilsen wrote that beginning with his service in the army, he constantly lived 2 separate lives, his real life and his fantasy life. He wrote, "When I was with people, I was in the real world, and in my private life, I snapped instantly into my fantasy life. I could oscillate between the two with instant ease."
With reference to the murders, Nilsen claimed that his emotional state upon the dates of the murders, in conjunction with the amount of alcohol he had consumed, were both core factors in his decision to kill. In January 2021, a former confidant of Nilsen's named Mark Austin revealed that an edited version of The History of a Drowning Boy was to be published by Red Door Press. The autobiography, based upon 6,000 pages of typewritten notes Nilsen authored while incarcerated, examines his life and crimes and is edited by Austin, who became a pen pal of Nilsen's in the years prior to his death and who exchanged more than 800 letters with him. The autobiography was published on January 21st, 2021, and is widely available to purchase.
Dennis Nilsen never saw any success from his book, though, as he died on May 12, 2018, from a pulmonary embolism. Nilsen's body was cremated in June 2018. This service was held with only 5 mourners present, including 3 prison officers and the individual whom Nilsen had corresponded while in prison. No family members were present at the service.
And that's it for the story of Dennis Nilsen.
That was, interesting.
Pretty gross, huh?
It's very identical to Jeffrey Dahmer.
It is. It's weird, isn't it?
Yeah, there's some fucked up people out there.
There sure is. All right, everyone. Thanks again for listening. Please make sure to subscribe to the show on whatever platform you're listening and rate and review. This really helps us branch out and reach a wider audience.
Thank you everyone for listening
To Paradise After Dark.
Bye.